A Trip into the Darkness. Chapter 11. Mallory watched Troy stand to retrieve the food that was delivered. Now that she didn't feel like a ravaged, crazed animal, she realized how hungry she was for things besides blood and sex. He looked so graceful as he brought the tray to her, squatting down in front of her. Her heart squeezed when he set the tray on the floor and continued to stay in a squatted position looking at her. Mallory pressed her back tight against the wall, waiting to see what his next move would be. His piercing eyes stared right through her. He was elegant and majestic, a man that she would have craved from afar, but yet would have been too timid to advance upon because of his air of power. Staring into his eyes, she wished he would have been revolting. He had no right to have such beauty. She had no right to want him. She was more messed up than she had ever realized. You need to eat. It'll help with your other cravings. His words brought the realization that her mouth was yet again throbbing along with her heartbeat. She ran her tongue over her sharp, lengthy teeth. No wonder her mouth hurt. Every tooth within her head was extended. Is it drugged? No, I've already sedated you, so there would be no reason for me to drug your food as well. Mallory glanced down at the water bottle sitting on the tray, then looked back up at Troy. The side of his mouth twitched up in a small smile. Reaching down, he picked up the bottle. Untwisting the cap, he brought it to his lips and took a sip. Twisting the cap back on, he placed it back on the tray. The electrical current between them was pulsating, and she wanted to lean towards him, needing to be closer to his power and touch. Watching the bob of his Adam's apple while he swallowed the water made her clench. With him this close to her, the room didn't seem to be spinning quite as quickly. Everything seemed to slow down. Reaching up a timid hand, she brushed her fingers across the stubble on his face. Okay, she whispered breathlessly, dropping her hand back to her side. She needed him to move away from her before she lost her composure and tried to touch him again. Troy's eyes narrowed. Another minute of him squatting in front of her, and he stood up, returning to his seat. With shaking hands, Mallory reached out to pick up the sandwich from the white tray. Taking a small bite, she tasted turkey, tomato, lettuce, and mayonnaise. It was delicious. Her stomach growled as she took another small bite. You're very unusual. Do you know that? Troy asked. Glancing up, she paused with her sandwich in hand. I've been told that a time or two, she replied, not certain what he was getting at. You have yet to beg me for your release, even though you have had plenty of opportunities. Would it do any good? She asked. Surely she had asked him to let her go at least once, right? She knew she was drugged up right now and was having a hard time getting her thoughts in order, but that seemed like an obvious thing she would have done by this point. Beg for her release. She knew in her heart that begging would be a waste, yet it was something she should have done. More than likely, she hadn't begged because when her pleas were ultimately denied, it would cause her to lose her sanity and send her spiraling down a dark hole in tears and despair. No, it would be a complete waste of your breath, but it seems like a natural response for someone who was being held against their will, he replied. Glancing around the room, she asked, Do you often kidnap people? No. You, dear Mallory, are the first person I have ever personally brought to this room. Troy's response seemed rather vague, like he was intentionally leaving out information. Finishing her sandwich, Mallory reached for the bottle for a long sip. With a sigh, she laid her head back against the wall. She was exhausted and felt like she should be asking him questions to figure out her situation better, yet she couldn't think of anything. Her brain was foggy, and her body felt like it was made of lead. She knew she should fight it, but her eyes drooped. Her body jerked and her eyes snapped open the instant she felt his hands picking her up from the floor. Hissing, she tried to fight her way out of his embrace as he carried her to the bed. A moment later, her back hit the soft mattress. Sitting up on her elbows, she stared up at him and waited. Standing above her, Troy's face was a mix of emotions. Bending down, he reached out a hand and caressed the side of her face. When she didn't jerk away from him, a smile tugged at his lips. Slowly, he dragged his fingers down her neck to trace her collarbones. Lust and hunger stirred within. She watched as his heartbeat at the side of his neck started to increase. She could smell his strong, lusty scent, and she wanted to throw herself off the bed and into his embrace. She needed to taste him. Even in her drug-induced haze, she was ravenous. When his fingers moved under the top of her shirt to her breasts, she arched to his touch, her claws digging into the soft bedding below her as his fingers captured one of her nipples. Troy rolled the hard nub in between his fingers, and she closed her eyes, fighting against her body and her burning desire to have him inside of her. The mattress sunk, and she realized that he was now straddling her on the bed. Mallory brought her hands up to strike him, but he captured them in a fist and secured them above her head. The hand at her breast squeezed, and she opened her mouth with a moan. Troy's mouth captured hers, and she bit down on his lip. As soon as his blood hit her palate, instinct took over, and she broke away from the kiss to search for his neck or shoulder to bite. She was clamoring to sink her teeth as deep into his skin as possible. Relief was immediate when he released her hands and leaned down, giving her access to his throat. Her arms wrapped around him, pulling him in close, while her aching teeth tore into his soft flesh. She began nursing in long, slow pulls. While she drank his blood, Troy worked himself in between her legs, and she wrapped them around his waist, wanting him as close as possible. Bucking and grinding his hips against her most sensitive flesh, she felt a wave of pleasure travel through her, making her hot and needy. The sensation simmering within felt wonderful while he rubbed against her aching cunt. A moment of regret filled her when Troy removed the hand that had been grabbing her breast and squeezing her nipple. She needed him to keep touching her. A loud moan escaped her when the same hand slid down her tummy and went to the front of her pants. When his fingers pressed inside of her, she felt like she was going to come undone. She felt him press 2 fingers deep into her tight pussy and move them in circles. She panted against his neck. When he worked a 3rd finger into her, she was overcome with an orgasm that had her body spasming. She hadn't realized she had released his neck to scream out her release until Troy sat up from her. "You are so wet and needy, my pet, hurting for something that only I can give you." "Yes, please, I need more," Mallory cried out, reaching for her, desperate for his body and blood. Her throat was still so dry, and her mouth hurt so much. "Tell me exactly what you need, Mallory. Tell me to stop now, and I will leave this room, and will not touch you again until you ask," Troy said, as his body froze above her. Her lust was driving her mad, and she desired to tell him that she wanted him inside of her, yet there was something that stopped her. She wasn't free. He had kidnapped her, locked her inside a concrete box, and changed her into a monster. Blinking her eyes, she felt tears run down the side of her cheeks. "I only want more of your blood," she panted. A look of disappointment spread across his beautiful face, and he clenched his jaw. Giving her a jerky nod, a deep rumble reverberated within his chest, and he fell back on top of her, offering her the opened wound on his throat. Mallory eagerly latched back onto him, and her tummy muscles clenched in anticipation. She felt so empty inside. "Such a needy pet," Troy whispered in her ear while holding himself still above her. "How I wish you would beg me to take your body, Mallory." Troy growled in her ear, his hips rocking into her core. Her hands went to his back, and her claws dug into his flesh. She struggled to pull him closer. She could feel moisture seeping out between her legs as his hard length pushed up against her, even while they were both fully clothed. His hands were in her hair, holding her close to his neck while she thrashed beneath him. "Easy, my sweet pet. I will give you everything you need," Troy panted as he rocked his hips into her core, harder and faster. She could feel another orgasm building inside of her while she brought her hips up to Troy with every buck he made. Her claws tore through the shirt on his back, shredding the material and digging into the flesh as she held on to him. The smell of his blood filled the room. His energy felt hot and demanding everywhere his bare skin touched hers, and it was driving her mad. Mallory broke her latch from his neck to yell, "Yes, I need. All you need is me," Troy told her before sitting up from her body. Reaching down, he yanked her shirt off of her before ripping his own t-shirt from his skin. Staring up at him, her mouth went dry. His body was glorious to behold. He was sculpted like a warrior, and his skin was bronze, as if he often laid outside in the sun without a shirt. The crazed part of her mind wanted him so badly. Her legs were still wrapped around his torso, and he was still positioned firmly in between her legs. She could feel her pussy throbbing as he held himself still above her. Her eyes took in every detail of his exposed chest and hers. Troy reached down and cupped her breast in his hand, Falling onto his elbows, his mouth found her nipple, and she was arching off the bed into his crotch. His caress was demanding, like he was forcing her to take as much of his energy as possible. It made her feel lightheaded and out of control. Mallory dug her nails into his chest, and blood dripped down onto her face and her body. Opening her mouth, she caught little droplets of the elixir on her tongue. Troy grunted in pain and desire as he resumed thrusting and rubbing himself into her clad body. Her tummy muscles constricted with the friction that he was giving her, and she could feel herself trembling with desire. One of Troy's hands went from caressing her breast to grabbing her neck, pinning her down as he applied pressure, and it was all she needed to come undone. She screamed in bliss. Her body combusted and her vaginal walls clamped down, searching for something that wasn't there. Troy didn't slow the pace of his thrusts into her body as she came down from the climax. Both her hands gripped the side of the mattress. She could feel her legs shaking as he humped her harder. "We are not finished yet, my pet," Troy growled as he released her throat and flipped her onto her hands and knees, grinding himself against her ass. She could feel his hard, long dick straining in between her ass cheeks, and the sensation made her shiver. One of his hands went to fist her hair, and he pulled her body up off the bed to continue riding her hard from behind. If his dick had actually been inside of her, it would have been one of the roughest fuckings she had in her entire life. Mallory cried out again. He was using her for his own pleasure, and her pussy throbbed as if she hadn't just came. She could feel her inner walls constricting, needing to be filled. Moaning loudly, he rocked into her, while his other hand snaked around to squeeze her throat. Both of her hands clutched at him, searching for something. Enjoyment filled her. When she felt his teeth sink into the side of her neck, she jerked and screamed. Troy held her firm while he fed from her, rocking himself in between her ass cheeks from behind. Pain throbbed through her neck while he drank deeply. She wanted to run away or disappear, anything to make him stop feeding from her. Troy's hand, which wasn't at her throat, left her hair and snaked around her body and started rubbing her clit. Her breath left her as a shock wave of pleasure coursed through her tummy. She wanted to tell him to stop, but she couldn't find her voice. Pleasure and pain rocketed throughout her system. She briefly wondered if it hurt him this much whenever she drank from his throat. That thought quickly disappeared. Troy's pace picked up to an almost unbearable speed. She felt like he was trying to tear through her, and the hand making circles on her clit increased. She wasn't certain how it happened, but a third orgasm shot through her as Troy grunted and finally released her neck while he shuddered from behind. Even through their clothing, she could feel his hot cum branding her ass. Panting, he released her to fall in the mattress face first. Her ass was still trapped in the air because of his hips pressing into her. Leaning down, she felt him lick the side of her neck that he had bitten. "That was such a good girl, Mallory. You pleased me tonight." Kissing the top of her head, he stood up from the bed. She tried to push herself up, but was too weak and shaky. Turning her head on the mattress, she found her vision was blurry as she watched him grab his torn shirt from the floor. Blood was smeared all over his chest and arms, making him look like a god of war. The sight was terrifying and magnificent. Reaching up, he pushed his longest blonde hair out of his face. It was the first time she had seen him with his hair ruffled, and if she hadn't been so exhausted, she'd have ran her fingers through the disgruntled locks. He cleared his throat before walking over to her and touching her shoulder. "You asleep now," he told her, and the room went dark.